Finally, I want to deal with a somewhat wider issue. One of the ways that we can test the credibility of a particular interpretation of a text is to ask how this interpretation fits with respect to the interpretation of other related texts. Simply put, we may ask, how does this interpretation of 1 Thessalonians 4, which pictures Christ as the returning king, fit with other prophetic texts? Similarly, we may ask, how does this text fit with other texts if one adopts the pre-tribulational interpretation? Again, those that view this formal greeting view have a metaphor in mind. The metaphor is the returning dignitary, the formal reception and then going back into the city. My question here in this section is simply to ask, look, does that metaphor of the dignitary being led back into the city, does that fit with any other prophetic texts? Or does the view of a pre-tribulational rapture, does that fit with other texts? In other words, which metaphor fits with the greatest number of other prophetic texts? Those who take the view of that apantesis as a technical term that points to the custom of the formal reception of a visiting dignitary assume, of course, that Jesus is that dignitary, and thus that the coming indicated in 1 Thessalonians 4:17 is his second coming. In this view, the term parousia has reference to one coming, since Paul did not predict two parousias, and that one event must encompass the gathering of the church and final judgment. From here, the advocates of this view contend that Paul goes directly in 1 Thessalonians 5:1-11 to speak of the same event, here designated the day of the Lord. And they often add to this argument by drawing supposed parallels between 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 5:11 and Matthew 24:29-44. Hold on. You're getting ready to pounce, I can tell. But just bear with me here. You know, whenever I hear somebody say that, Barbara Rossing has this section in her book. It's like one of her really big arguments. And she's using Matthew 24 and saying, see, this is the rapture and all kinds of things going on. You know, I just delighted in sort of slamming her with that one. I said, you are so wrong on that, as I show here. In response, it may be pointed out that parousia is used in a number of passages in the New Testament in a general and not technical way to describe someone simply coming. I'll drop off. A study of the New Testament of this term reveals that parousia, literally a presence, denotes both the arrival and consequent presence with. In some passages, the word gives prominence to the beginning of that period, the course of the period being implied. References. In some, the course is prominent. In others, the conclusion of the period is prominent. I should have said. In other words, the term can be used to describe the entire period of the Lord's appearing or particular features or events that occur in the course of that appearing. So there's one parousia, but not one-dimensional, and it does not occur all at once. Thus, while 1 Thessalonians 5:1-11 certainly continues the general theme of the parousia, it is quite clear that Paul has begun a new topic. He even uses the typical transitional phrase peride, which indicates a new subject. Here in 5:1-11, Paul is stepping back. He fell asleep. That's why it didn't happen. Paul is stepping back and looking over not just the immediate occasion of the catching up and the meeting in the air, but the wider picture of the day of the Lord. The phrase designates the whole program of events, including the tribulation period, the second Advent program, the entire millennial age. Paul is simply moving from the specific to the general, from a focus on one part of the whole end times program, the rapture, to the broader picture of the times and epochs. There's no reason to think that 1 Thessalonians 4:13-18 and 5:1-11 must be speaking of, quote, precisely the same event, or that taking 1 Thessalonians 5:1-11 as referring to events after the catching up of 4:17 is an instance of special pleading. However, there's some very strong reasons to think that Paul is describing in 1 Thessalonians 4 and what, for instance, Jesus is referring to in Matthew 24 are very different events. As noted, the advocates of the view of that apantesis is a technical term that points to the custom of a formal reception of a visiting dignitary, often assume that 1 Thessalonians 4:15-17 is a description of the second coming. This is a fairly common error. I'm sure you're surprised to hear that one, right? Not. Paul Ben-Ware has analyzed the main passages dealing with the rapture and those dealing with the second coming and has identified several contrasts that indicate that the two events are indeed different. The following chart conveys the point. The place... That didn't come across too well, did it? The place of the rapture, the Lord comes in the air and returns to the Father's house. The place of the second coming, the Lord descends to the Mount of Olives and remains on earth. The purpose of the rapture, the Lord comes to gather and unite and bless His church. glorified bodies. Lord, in the second coming, the Lord comes to judge unbelievers, wrath, and no glorified bodies. The result of the rapture, no mention of establishing a kingdom, believers are removed from the earth. The result of the second coming, the Lord comes to establish the kingdom, and believers remain on earth. The time of the rapture is imminent, any time. The time of the second coming is after the tribulation. These are two separate accounts, Ben Ware concludes. On the other hand, those who take Paul as teaching the pre-tribulation rapture view in 1 Thessalonians 4 can tie this understanding to an impressive, wider than the formal reception dignitary view, biblical metaphor that places it on firmer footing. When suggested earlier, one considers how the interpretation fits with the other passages. The metaphor is that of the church as the bride of Christ, the bridegroom. Robert Sussy writes, one of the most beautiful images of the church is that of the bride of Christ. The metaphor appears prominently in Ephesians 5, where Paul uses the union of Christ and his church to illustrate the relationship of husband and wife. Understanding the key aspects of this metaphor requires a knowledge of ancient wedding customs with which the disciples in the early church would have been assuredly acquainted. And my point there is to kind of look back to the idea that the Thessalonians may have had this coded language, and they may have been sort of undermining the empire without letting anybody know exactly what they were doing. And I don't think they were involved in anything like that at all, but they would have been deeply steeped in the metaphor of the Jewish wedding customs and bride and bridegrooms, etc. Again, Sozi describes the main features of these customs that are pertinent to the understanding of the main metaphor. He writes, quote, the Oriental practice of marriage consisted of 3 stages. First came the betrothal, which was more than a promise of marriage. It was the very initiation of marriage, for the bride was legally considered a married woman from the time of her betrothal. After the betrothal, there would follow an indefinite time of preparation. This time was devoted to, on man's part, the preparation for the future home, the woman's part, preparation of herself for the new role that she was intended to fulfill. At an undesignated time, there would be the retrieval, when the actual marriage would take place. On that day, the bridegroom and his friends went to the home of the bride, and then the company of the bride and her friends, the festal company, proceeded to their future home. When the couple arrived at their future home, there would be a more formal ceremony of presentation, and it often was a friend of the bridegroom who made the presentation of the bride to the groom. Then would follow the marriage and a supper time of celebration. It is that simple outline, and I've simplified it even more than we know that could be really well fleshed out and has been by a number of people. I suggest that forms the background to the understanding of the significance of the several passages that teach the rapture of the church, including 1 Thessalonians 4. The first passage in the New Testament revealing the rapture of the church is found in John 14, 1-3, recorded in the very words of the bridegroom himself. It is a promise to fulfill the tasks of the bridegroom in preparation, and a promise in anticipation of the time of retrieval. The church is presently the betrothed bride of Christ. The text noted earlier, Ephesians 5, indicates that the bride, the church, is to be active as well, fulfilling her part in the period of preparation. Then follows the course of actual retrieval, and this is obviously what 1 Thessalonians 4, 15-17 is all about. Following the analogy of the Oriental practice, the church, as the bride, now waits the coming of Christ to take her to himself, again alluding to John 14:3. The Apostle Paul speaks of this day in 1 Thessalonians 4, 16-17. Finally, the retrieval leads to presentation, and only in this case, Christ presents his own bride to himself. He and no other presents the bride, and he and no other receives her to himself. After the presentation, there follows the marriage supper, which of course is indicated in Revelation 19, 7-9. The fact that we can fit 1 Thessalonians 4 into this wider biblical metaphor of Christ and his bride does not prove the pre-tribulational rapture, but it does offer the more satisfying and biblically consistent picture of the prophetic event in view in 1 Thessalonians 4:17 than the dubious opinion of the formal reception of a dignitary view. Thank you for your patience. You're very, very patient.
Thank you, Kevin.